Admiral Juan Park stood motionless on the bridge of the ESS Dauntless, her eyes fixed on the massive holographic display dominating the center of the command deck. The blue light from the projection cast shadows across her face, highlighting the deep lines of worry etched around her eyes. 58 years old with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, Juwan had served in Earth's combined space forces for 35 years. She had never expected to face humanity's extinction during her command. The hologram showed the solar system in miniature, with Earth as a small blue dot. At the edge, marked in alarming red, were 300 Kelvarian capital ships, massive structures that dwarfed anything humanity had built. They moved in perfect formation, an armada of destruction heading directly toward Earth. "Magnify Sector 7, Juwan ordered, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. The display zoomed in, showing the lead Kelvarian vessel. It resembled a giant arrowhead, its black surface covered with odd protrusions that intelligence suggested were weapons systems unlike anything humans had encountered. No one knew exactly what the Kelvarians looked like. They had never shown themselves in the brief encounters at the outer colonies. Lieutenant Minho Choi, her executive officer, approached with a tablet. "Latest calculations confirm, Admiral. They'll be in optimal firing range in 6 hours." Juwan took the tablet, scanning the data. The projections were grim. Earth's defenses would last perhaps 20 minutes against such overwhelming force. The retrofitted cargo ships and hastily constructed defense platforms represented humanity's best efforts, but they were wholly inadequate. "How many civilian transports have managed to evacuate?" she asked. "Only 12% of the planned evacuation has been completed," Minho replied. "Even if we had a week, we couldn't get everyone off planet, and the Kelvarians have already destroyed the Mars colony. There's nowhere to run." Juwan handed back the tablet. Around her, the bridge crew worked frantically at their stations, but she could see the despair in their movements. They all knew what was coming. "The Security Council transmission is ready, Admiral," called out Communications Officer Yunju Kang. Juwan straightened her uniform jacket and stepped toward the communication screen. The faces of 12 people appeared, the highest authorities left on Earth. Among them was President Taeyong Shin, his face ashen. "Admiral Park, our long-range sensors confirm your assessment," the president said. "We have authorized all defensive measures, including our nuclear arsenal." "With respect, Mr. President, our simulations show nuclear weapons will be ineffective against their shielding technology," Juwan replied. A heavy silence fell. They all knew what she wasn't saying, that conventional weapons would not save Earth. "Then we must use unconventional weapons," said a woman in the corner of the screen. Director Sun Hee-yu of Global Defense Research, her face half hidden in shadow. The president looked uncomfortable. "Director Yu, the horror space program has never been field-tested. The risks outweigh extinction, Mr. President." Sun Hee interrupted. "We designed this program for exactly this scenario." Juwan felt a chill run down her spine. Everyone in high command knew about horror space, but few understood what it truly meant. The program had been developed in secret over decades, hidden even from most of the military. After a long pause, the president nodded. "The Security Council has voted. Authorization code Delta 9 Horror is now active. Admiral Park, you are ordered to execute Operation Nightmare immediately." The screen went dark, leaving Juwan alone with the weight of what was to come. "Lieutenant Choi," she said, turning to her XO, "send the authorization to Horror Space Division. Tell them Operation Nightmare begins now." As Minho hurried to transmit the order, Juwan walked to the viewport, looking out at Earth shining below. She thought about what humanity was about to unleash. Throughout history, certain people had seen things others couldn't, visions dismissed as hallucinations, dreams considered mere fantasy. Artists painted impossible landscapes, writers described geometries that couldn't exist, and patients with certain neurological conditions reported seeing beyond the veil of reality. 50 years ago, Dr. Hyun Kim, a brilliant physicist with schizophrenia, had made a startling discovery while working on quantum theory. Those visions weren't hallucinations. They were glimpses of a parallel dimension that existed alongside our own, a place Dr. Kim had named horror space because of its incomprehensible nature. Far from the empty vacuum between stars, horror space was a realm of consciousness, where thought and matter were interchangeable, where the laws of physics bent in ways that drove most observers mad. Dr. Kim had built the first bridge to horror space before taking his own life, unable to live with what he had seen. But his work continued in secret, funded by military interests who sought its potential. If humans could access this dimension, they might harness energies beyond conventional understanding. They might create weapons no enemy could comprehend. "Admiral, I have Director Jawan Han of Horror Space Division on secure channel," Minho called out. Jawan turned back to the screen, where a thin man with hollow eyes appeared. Behind him, massive machinery hummed. "We've received the authorization, Admiral," Jawan said. "The pilots are ready." "How many?" Jawan asked. 5,000, as planned. All volunteers. Volunteers who knew they might never be the same, Jawan thought. The interface with horror space changed people. Extended exposure was known to cause permanent psychological damage. "How long before deployment?" she asked. 2 hours to full breach, another hour for the fleet to manifest in normal space. Jawan did the calculation. It would be close. The Kelvarians will be in firing range by then. "We'll make it, Admiral," Jawan assured her. "The pilots are already entering their pods." Deep beneath the Antarctic ice, in a facility unknown to the public, 5,000 men and women were sealing themselves into neural interface chambers. Each had undergone years of psychological conditioning to prepare their minds for horror space. They would serve as anchors, their consciousness stretching between dimensions to bring forth weapons beyond human understanding. "Begin the sequence," Jawan ordered. "And Jawan, tell the pilots that Earth stands with them." As the communication ended, Admiral Park returned to the holographic display. The red dots of the Kelvarian fleet moved inexorably closer. "All ships to defensive positions," she ordered. "We need to buy time." Earth's modest battle fleet began to move, taking up positions that would intercept the Kelvarian advance. They were vastly outmatched, but they only needed to delay the enemy for a few hours, long enough for humanity to unleash its darkest secret, a fleet born from the nightmares at the edge of perception, pulled forth by 5,000 minds screaming across the boundary between what is and what should not be. The Kelvarian fleet commander had ordered all transmissions to be broadcast across every frequency. It wasn't enough to destroy the humans. They wanted the entire solar system to witness the extinction of this troublesome species. As a result, billions of beings throughout human colonies and settlements watched their screens in silent dread as Earth's final hours approached. On the last surviving dome of the Mars colony, physicist Do-Yim Lee gathered his family in their small living quarters. The colony had already suffered a partial attack 3 days earlier, destroying the main habitat dome and killing thousands. Only the emergency backup systems kept the remaining colonists alive. Do-Yim's children, 9-year-old Mina and 7-year-old June, huddled close to their father as they watched the emergency broadcast. The screen showed Earth's small defensive fleet moving into position, a pitiful array compared to the massive Kelvarian armada closing in. "Dad, are those bad aliens going to kill everyone?" June asked, his small face pale with fear. Do-Yim pulled his son closer. A brilliant physicist who had once worked on the early horror space theories, he knew more than most about what was about to happen. "Those ships are coming to hurt us," he admitted. There was no point lying to his children now. "But there's something they don't know about humans." Mina looked up at her father, tears streaming down her face. "What, Dad?" Do-Yim's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "When we're cornered, we become something else. On the screen, the newscaster was explaining how Earth's remaining nuclear weapons were being prepared for a last-ditch defense. Do-hyun knew these conventional weapons would be useless, but he also knew what was happening in Antarctica right now. The secret project he had helped develop before transferring to Mars. "Come with me," he said suddenly, standing and pulling his children toward the small storeroom at the back of their quarters. But the emergency broadcast said to stay by the screens. Minna protested. "Trust me," Do-hyun said. "There are things you need to understand." In the storeroom, Do-hyun pushed aside some boxes to reveal a small device attached to the wall. It wasn't standard colony equipment. He had built it himself, a miniature version of the sensors used in the horror space research. "What's that?" Jun asked. "A window," Do-hyun said simply. He activated the device, and a small holographic display appeared. "In about 20 minutes, this will show you why humans might survive today." Across the solar system, similar scenes played out. Families huddled together in the mining colonies of the asteroid belt. Research scientists on the moons of Jupiter clutched each other's hands. Ship crews throughout the system watched in silence as humanity faced extinction. The Kelvarians had made sure everyone could see. It was to be their moment of triumph. Deep beneath the Antarctic ice, Dr. Ji Song moved with purpose through the Horror Space Command Center. At 43, she had spent the last 15 years of her life in this secret facility, continuing the work of her mentor, Dr. Gun Kim. The facility was a marvel of engineering. A vast complex carved into the ice, powered by geothermal energy, and shielded from detection. The central chamber stretched nearly a kilometer in diameter, filled with 5,000 neural interface pods arranged in concentric circles. Each pod contained a pilot, men and women who had volunteered for what many considered a suicide mission. "Status report," Ji demanded as she entered the control room overlooking the pod chamber. "All pilots are connected and stable," replied her assistant, Dr. Hannah Kim. "The horror space breach point is forming according to calculations." Ji nodded, her eyes fixed on the massive monitors showing the pilot's neural patterns. Each pilot was already in a medically induced altered state of consciousness, the only way humans could begin to perceive the dimensions beyond normal reality. "And the anchor system?" Ji asked. "Holding steady, the quantum fields are aligned." The anchor system was perhaps the most important component, the technology designed to keep the pilots' minds from being completely lost in horror space. Without it, they would never find their way back to normal reality. Ji Li moved to the central console and placed her palm on the activation scanner. "Begin final sequence." The lights dimmed as power surged into the system. In the pod chamber below, a strange shimmer began to appear in the air above the pods, like heat waves but darker, as if the very fabric of reality was starting to bend. The intercom system crackled. "Dr. Song, this is Admiral Park. The Kelvarians are accelerating their approach. We have less time than predicted." "Understood," Ji replied, her voice calm despite the pressure. "We're initiating breach now." She turned to the room full of scientists and technicians. These people had devoted their lives to an experiment that might save humanity, or might destroy the minds of 5,000 volunteers. Horror space entry in 3. Ji began the countdown, her finger hovering over the final activation. 2. The shimmer above the pods intensified, darkening until it looked like a pool of liquid shadow suspended in midair. 1. Ji pressed the activation control. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The shadow pool expanded in a sudden rush, and a sound filled the facility, not through the speakers, but directly in the minds of everyone present. It was 5,000 human voices screaming in perfect unison as their consciousnesses were thrust beyond the boundaries of normal reality. On the neural monitors, brainwave patterns spiked in ways that should have been impossible, patterns that human brains weren't designed to produce. The pilots were no longer fully in this dimension. Their minds stretched between realities, perceiving things no human was meant to see. "Breach stable," shouted one of the technicians, though his voice was shaking. All pilots are connected to horror space. GI stared at the monitors, forcing herself to remain clinical despite the disturbing images. On some screens, the pilots' faces contorted in expressions of terror and wonder. Some were crying, others laughing uncontrollably. All of them were experiencing something beyond normal human comprehension. "Begin stage 2, she ordered. "Start the fleet manifestation process." In the pods, the pilots were now facing the most difficult task, using their minds to shape horror space energies into forms that could exist in normal space. They had trained for years in simulations, but this was the first true test. Captain Minjin Ryu, lead pilot of what would become the flagship, felt his mind stretching like taffy being pulled in infinite directions. Horror space wasn't empty. It was filled with presence, intelligence, patterns that defied understanding, colors that couldn't exist, geometries that broke the rules of mathematics. Focus, he told himself, though he no longer had a physical voice. Remember the anchor. Remember the ship design. Minjin concentrated on the mental image they had practiced, a vessel that could channel horror space energies while existing in normal space. Around him, he sensed the other pilots doing the same, their minds linking in ways that would have been impossible in the physical world. Together, they began to pull something through the breach, a fleet born from human consciousness and horror space energy combined. On Mars, Do-Hyun's sensor suddenly activated. His children gasped as the small holographic display showed something impossible, space itself seeming to tear open near Earth's orbit. "Dad, what's happening?" Minna whispered. Do-Hyun's voice was filled with wonder and dread. Humanity's last hope, and maybe its greatest mistake. Throughout the solar system, billions watched as reality itself began to warp near Earth. The Kelvarian broadcast continued, but now there was confusion in the alien communications. Something unexpected was happening, something their sensors couldn't explain. In Antarctica, Ji-Song watched the external feeds with a mixture of triumph and horror as the first horror space vessel began to materialize in normal reality. It was working. Operation Nightmare was underway. But the screams of the pilots hadn't stopped. And deep in horror space, something ancient had taken notice of the human intrusion. High Commander Rox of the Kelvarian Dominion stood proudly on the command deck of his flagship, the inevitable Conquest. At over 8 feet tall with iridescent scales covering his muscular frame, he cut an imposing figure even among his own kind. The massive viewscreen before him showed Earth, a blue-green jewel that would soon be added to the Kelvarian collection of conquered worlds. "Begin recording," Rox ordered, his four-fingered hand adjusting the ceremonial cape draped over his battle armor. A small drone floated up, its lens focusing on the commander. This moment would be broadcast across the 1,000 worlds of the Dominion, proof of his greatness and the unstoppable might of the Kelvarian war machine. "People of the Dominion," Rox began, his voice deep and resonant. "Today we claim the human homeworld as our own. Their primitive defenses crumble before our might. Their leaders beg for mercy it will not come. Let this be a lesson to all who would defy." A piercing alarm cut through his speech. Red warning lights flashed across the command deck. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Rox snarled, turning to his crew. Science Officer Tev was hunched over his sensor station, his scales paling to a sickly white. "Commander, something is happening near the human defense line." "Explain," Rox demanded. I cannot," Tev admitted, his hands trembling over the controls. "Our sensors are detecting a spatial anomaly, unlike anything in our records." Rox strode to the view screen, ordering it to focus on the disturbance. What he saw made even his warrior's heart skip a beat. Space itself seemed to bleed. There was no other way to describe it. A dark, viscous tear had appeared in the vacuum, spreading like a wound in reality. Around its edges, stars bent in impossible ways, light twisting into patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Is this some kind of human weapon?" Rox demanded. Before Tev could answer, the anomaly expanded. From within the darkness, Shapes began to emerge, shapes that defied comprehension. They resembled ships, but unlike any vessels Rox had ever seen in centuries of warfare. The first to fully materialize appeared to be made of twisted bone and shadow, its surface constantly shifting like dark water. It had no visible engines, yet it moved with purpose. Parts of it seemed to phase in and out of existence, as though it couldn't fully commit to being in normal space. "Magnify that vessel," Rox ordered, his voice quieter now. The view screen zoomed in, showing details that made several bridge officers turn away in distress. The ship's hull was covered in what looked like faces, human faces frozen in expressions of terror and rage, their features constantly morphing into one another. Spires rose from its upper surface, like the spines of some prehistoric beast, but they curved in ways that shouldn't have been structurally possible. More vessels emerged from the rift, each unique but equally disturbing. One resembled an enormous octopus made of metallic glass, its tentacles curling around what might have been weapon arrays. Another looked like a cathedral from human Gothic architecture, but inverted and twisted, with what appeared to be internal organs visible through transparent sections of its hull. What are those things?" Rox demanded, unable to keep the tremor from his voice. Tev's scales had now turned completely white, the Kelvarian equivalent of extreme fear. "According to our sensors, they simultaneously exist and don't exist. Parts of them register as solid matter, while other parts show energy patterns our systems cannot classify. They appear to be bleeding from another dimension into ours." On the command deck of what the fleet designation system had labeled as Nightmare Actual, Captain Minjin Ryu no longer existed solely in physical space. His consciousness stretched between dimensions, his body still in the neural pod beneath Antarctica, while his mind helped shape the horror space vessel around him. The experience was beyond description. Minjin could see his ship both from within and without simultaneously. He could feel every part of its structure, as though it were an extension of his own body. More disturbingly, he could sense the other pilots, not through communication systems, but directly mind to mind. "Focus," he projected to the fleet. "Remember your training. Shape the horror space energy according to the designs." The ships continued to take form, solidifying into the physical realm while maintaining their connection to horror space. This was the key to their power. They existed in both realities at once, drawing energy and capabilities from the dimension beyond normal physics. Minjin directed his attention to the Kelvarian fleet. Through the strange perceptions granted by his partial existence in horror space, he could see the aliens' fear. It radiated from their vessels like heat waves, a palpable energy that the horror spaceships could actually feed upon. Their broadcasting came the thought from Communications Officer Jan Kim, another pilot whose mind was linked to the fleet consciousness. "They want to know what we are." "Let them wonder," Minjin responded. "Prepare to engage." Across the fleet, human pilots channeled their emotions into the fabric of their vessels. The neural interfaces translated human feelings into horror space energy, and as the pilots faced the enemy that had come to exterminate their species, their fear, rage, and determination became weapons. On the Kelvarian flagship, Commander Rox watched in growing horror as the impossible fleet formed a perfect attack formation. There were perhaps 200 of the Nightmare vessels, far fewer than his 300 warships. But something told him that traditional numbers meant nothing against these abominations. "Order the fleet to open fire," he commanded. "Maximum power to all weapon systems." The Kelvarian armada responded immediately, energy beams and plasma torpedoes lancing out toward the horror space fleet. For a moment, Rox felt a surge of confidence as the devastating barrage, enough firepower to level continents, streaked toward the enemy. Then the impossible happened. Instead of impacting the vessels, the weapons fire seemed to bend around them, as if reality itself was warping to protect the Nightmare ships. Some beams simply vanished into dark patches that appeared and disappeared on the ship's hulls. Others changed direction without any apparent cause, streaking harmlessly into empty space. "Our weapons are ineffective," Tev reported, his voice barely a whisper. "It's as if they're not fully present in our dimension." Before Rox could respond, one of the horror space vessels, a twisting spiral of what looked like crystallized darkness, moved toward the Kelvarian left flank. It didn't accelerate in any normal sense. Instead, it seemed to stretch across space, simultaneously existing at its starting point and its destination before fully committing to the new position. From the vessel, tendrils of absolute blackness extended outward. Where they touched Kelvarian ships, strange transformations began. Metal aged and rusted in seconds. Energy systems flickered and died. On some vessels, the hull simply ceased to exist where the tendrils passed, exposing crews to the vacuum of space. Evasive maneuvers. Rox bellowed, but it was already too late. The horror space fleet was among them now, moving in ways that defied normal space travel. Some phased through Kelvarian vessels, leaving destruction in their wake. Others seemed to pull Kelvarian ships partially into the rift they had emerged from, returning only twisted, broken hulls. On Nightmare Actual, Minjin felt the power coursing through the fleet. The ships were performing beyond even the theoretical models. The boundary between thought and matter in horror space allowed them to manifest abilities that broke the laws of physics. But there was a cost. Already, Minjin could feel pilots slipping away, their minds unable to withstand prolonged exposure to horror space. And worse, he sensed something watching from the depths of that other dimension. Something ancient and curious that had noticed the human intrusion. "Press the attack," he commanded the fleet. "We must finish this quickly." The horror space vessels accelerated their assault, bringing humanity's nightmares to life against those who had threatened their existence. The battle had only just begun, but already the outcome seemed clear. The hunters had become the hunted. The Kelvarians were learning what it meant to face humanity when pushed beyond the edge of desperation. Commander Rox's flagship shuddered as another horror space vessel phased through its lower decks. Alarms blared across all stations. Emergency force fields failed faster than they could be established. Crew members screamed as sections of the mighty warship simply ceased to exist around them. "Return fire, all weapons," Rox roared, but his orders were increasingly pointless. Conventional weapons were useless against the human nightmare fleet. Energy beams passed harmlessly through the vessels or bent away at impossible angles. Physical projectiles slowed and stopped before reaching their targets, hanging suspended in space before crumbling to dust. The horror space vessel designated Widow's Lament approached a Kelvarian heavy cruiser. Its form resembled a massive ribcage made of shifting darkness, with what looked like human faces occasionally pressing outward from within, mouths open in silent screams. From its core, tendrils of pure blackness extended outward, wrapping around the Kelvarian ship. Where the tendrils touched, metal aged centuries in seconds. Pristine alloys rusted, crumbled, and disintegrated. The process spread like a disease, consuming the cruiser from the outside in. Within moments, what had been a state-of-the-art warship became a floating ruin, its crew trapped inside a vessel that was falling apart around them. "Science Officer Tev, explain this," Rox demanded, watching another squadron of his ships being torn apart. Tev's scales had lost all color, turning a sickly white. "They're using weapons that operate outside normal physics, Commander. The energy signatures suggest they're somehow manipulating time and space at a quantum level. They're breaking down the fundamental forces that hold matter together." Across the battlefield, the horror space vessel, Memory of Nightfall, opened what appeared to be massive cannon ports. But instead of conventional energy weapons, they fired crystalline projectiles that glowed with an inner darkness. Where these projectiles struck Kelvarian ships, they didn't explode. They expanded, growing crystal structures that consumed the vessels from within. Crew members touched by the crystals reported seeing their worst fears made manifest before they lost contact. The crystals were literally formed from human nightmare energy, given physical form through the bridge between dimensions. Inside the neural interfaced pod beneath Antarctica, Captain Human Kang struggled to maintain his grip on reality. As pilot of Memory of Nightfall, he channeled his consciousness through horror space to control his vessel, but the experience was taking a devastating toll. Human's perception had fractured. He simultaneously saw the battle through normal space, through horror space, and through a dozen other perspectives that had no names in human language. Colors had tastes, sounds had physical weight. Time flowed differently, sometimes stretching into near infinity, other times compressing until entire minutes passed in what felt like seconds. I can't hold on much longer, he projected to the fleet consciousness. From Nightmare Actual, Minjun's thoughts reached back to him. Stay with us, human. Focus on your anchor. Each pilot had an anchor, a memory, a loved one, something deeply personal that helped them remember their humanity while their minds stretched across dimensions. For Human, it was his daughter's face. He struggled to hold that image in his mind as horror space pulled at his consciousness, trying to draw him deeper. Throughout the fleet, other pilots fought similar battles within themselves. Some were already lost. Their bodies still functioned in the pods, but their minds had fragmented, unable to withstand the strain of existing in multiple realities. Lieutenant Sora Kim, piloting the vessel Whisper of Regret, had stopped responding to the fleet consciousness 10 minutes into the battle. Her ship continued to fight, but it was being driven by something else now. The broken fragments of her mind merged with horror space energies into something no longer fully human. The price was terrible, but the pilots fought on. They had volunteered knowing the risks. Earth had no other defense against the Kelvarian invasion. On thousands of worlds across the galaxy, alien civilizations watched the battle in stunned silence. The Kelvarians had broadcast their attack as propaganda, a demonstration of their power. Instead, they were witnessing something unprecedented. On the desert world of Trinsaw, the Council of Elders gathered around viewing pools, their triple eyes wide with shock. The humans have done the impossible, Elder Vash whispered. They'd weaponized the Dreamdark. Every civilization discovers the Dreamdark eventually, replied Elder Nor. But all who study it learn to step away. The danger is too great. The humans were desperate, said Elder Kree. They had no choice. That is what makes them so frightening, Vash concluded. They will do what others fear to do. Similar conversations occurred across the galaxy as advanced species recognized what humanity had accomplished. Some reacted with horror, others with newfound respect, but all with the sudden realization that humans were far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. In the Galactic Hub, the ancient Morrigan ambassador watched multiple feeds of the battle, its crystalline body vibrating with distress signals. Mark this day, it communicated to its aides. The galaxy has changed forever. Back in the battle, the Kelvarian fleet was being systematically dismantled. Commander Rox watched helplessly as his mighty armada, winner of 100 campaigns, was reduced to floating debris and distress calls. Prepare the quantum drive, he ordered. We must retreat and warn the Dominion. The drive is offline, Commander, his engineering officer reported. Something is interfering with the activation sequence. On Rox's view screen, a horror space vessel approached his flagship. Unlike the others, this one had a recognizable shape. It resembled a massive human hand, fingers spread wide, composed of what looked like living shadow and pulsing red energy that mimicked blood vessels. They've blocked all escape routes, Tev reported, his voice hollow. They're herding the remaining ships into a containment formation. Rox slammed his fist on the command console. How? How did these primitives develop such weapons? Our intelligence said they barely had interplanetary travel. No one answered. There was no explanation that would satisfy a warrior facing defeat. The battle lasted less than an hour. One by one, Kelvarian ships were destroyed or disabled. Some simply vanished, pulled fully into horror space, never to return. Others were left as floating hulks, their crews either dead or driven mad by exposure to weapons that attacked mind and matter equally. When it ended, not a single Kelverian vessel remained functional. Where the proud invasion fleet had been, there was now only debris and echoing distress calls that would never be answered. The horror space fleet regrouped, forming a perfect geometric pattern that shouldn't have been possible for vessels to maintain. They hovered in formation, their impossible forms rippling against the backdrop of stars, occasionally phasing partially in and out of normal space. In the Antarctic facility, Dr. Ji Song watched the sensor feeds with a mixture of triumph and dread. They had succeeded beyond all expectations. Humanity was saved. But as the medical teams rushed to extract pilots from their pods, she saw the true cost of their victory. Many pilots were comatose, their minds unable to fully return from horror space. Others screamed continuously, seeing things that weren't there. Some spoke in languages that had never existed on Earth, their perception permanently altered by exposure to the other dimension. And in the deep monitoring systems, Ji noticed something that chilled her to the core. The breach to horror space wasn't closing as planned. Something was keeping it open. Something from the other side that had taken an interest in humanity's desperate gambit. The battle was over. Earth was saved. But Ji feared that a much larger conflict had just begun. The massive diplomatic vessel hung in Earth orbit, its crystalline structure reflecting sunlight in patterns that seemed deliberately beautiful. Named Peaceful Discourse by its Morrigan builders, the ship served as neutral ground for the hastily arranged summit. Inside, representatives from 17 galactic civilizations had gathered, some traveling across hundreds of light years in a matter of days, using technologies humans had never dreamed possible. Admiral Juan Park stood by the viewport in her formal dress uniform, watching Earth rotate slowly below. The blue planet showed no visible scars from the battle that had nearly ended human civilization. She touched the viewport, her fingers trembling slightly. 3 days had passed since Operation Nightmare. 3 days since humanity had revealed itself to be far more dangerous than anyone in the galaxy had suspected. "The first drink at these functions is always the hardest to find," said a voice behind her. Juan turned to see a tall, slender being approach. Its body appeared to be made of interlocking crystal structures that shifted and changed colors with its movements. The Morrigan ambassador, one of the oldest species in the known galaxy. "I don't believe I should be drinking right now," Juan replied carefully. The crystalline being made a sound like wind chimes, apparently laughter. "A wise choice. The Zentari punch contains compounds that would cause your heart to stop in approximately 3 minutes. A translator drone hovered nearby, converting the ambassador's harmonic speech into human language. The technology was far beyond Earth's capabilities, just one of many revelations the past few days had brought. "Strange," Juan said. 3 days ago, none of these civilizations answered our distress calls. Now they rush to meet us." The ambassador's colors shifted to a deep blue. "Fear and respect often travel together, Admiral Park. What your species accomplished against the Kelverians has altered how the galaxy perceives humanity." Around the reception hall, diplomats from across the galaxy mingled. Some resembled humans closely enough to pass on Earth with minor disguises. Others were so alien that Juan struggled to understand how their bodies functioned. All of them occasionally glanced toward the human delegation, with expressions their translators defined as cautious concern. "You have done something unprecedented," the Morrigan ambassador continued, its translators struggling with the concept. "You have weaponized that which should not exist in our reality." "We didn't have a choice," Juan replied simply. The crystalline being vibrated slightly. "That is precisely what terrifies us, Admiral. Most species discover horror space, though we have different names for it. The Zentari call it the realm of unmaking. My people name it the discordant harmony. But all who glimpse it recognize the danger and step away." "The Kelverians gave us no option," Juan said. "They came to exterminate us." "Indeed. The Dominion will trouble no one for some time. Their leadership is in chaos after losing their elite fleet." The ambassador paused. "But you must understand what you have done. You opened a door that has remained closed for good reason. Across the room, Earth's President Taeyong Shin was signing the newly drafted Treaty of Seoul, a document recognizing Earth as a sovereign power with protected status under galactic law. The other species had drafted it with remarkable speed. "Your horror space fleet," the ambassador said quietly. "What has become of it?" Jiwan hesitated. That information was classified at the highest level, but something told her the Morian already knew the answer. "The ships dissipated when the pilots were disconnected," she said carefully. "They cannot exist without human minds to anchor them." "Cannot exist yet," the ambassador corrected. "But the breach remains, does it not? Smaller, but present." Jiwan felt a chill. How did they know? In the medical facility beneath Antarctica, Dr. Ji Song moved quietly between the recovery beds. Of the 5,000 pilots who had entered horror space, 3,723 had survived physically. But their minds were another matter entirely. She stopped at the bed of pilot Yoon-ha Yoon. Once a brilliant tactical officer, Yoon-ha now lay strapped to her bed, her eyes open but seeing something beyond the room. She had been screaming for 3 days straight, until her voice gave out. Now she simply mouthed words in a language no one recognized. "Any change?" Jai asked the attending physician. Dr. Minho Kang shook his head. "She's the same. Like the others in her condition, her brain scans show activity patterns unlike anything in medical literature. It's as if parts of her mind are still elsewhere." Jay nodded grimly. Yoon-ha was one of 42 pilots showing this particular symptom, what the medical team had started calling partial dimensional displacement. "Has she said anything coherent?" Jai asked. "Just what she repeated the first day," Minho replied. "About something noticing them, something following them back." Yoon-ha suddenly turned her head, looking directly at Jai with perfect clarity. "They're coming through," she said in a completely normal voice. "They found the door we made. They like our reality better than theirs." Then her eyes glazed over again, and she returned to silently mouthing words in the unknown language. Ji-I hurried from the room, making her way to the central monitoring station. The horror space breach had been shrinking since the battle ended, but at a much slower rate than their models had predicted. According to their calculations, it should have closed completely within hours after the pilots disconnected. "Status report," she demanded as she entered the monitoring room. Lead technician Ju Park looked up from his console, his face pale with exhaustion. "The breach is stable at 0.3% of its original size. It's not shrinking anymore." "That's impossible," Jai said, moving to the screens. "Once the pilots disconnected." "I know the theory, Doctor," Ju interrupted. "But the readings are clear. Something is keeping it open from the other side." The sensor feeds showed the breach, now just a pinpoint of absolute darkness hanging in space near Earth's orbit, small but persistent, a doorway between dimensions that refused to close. In the presidential bunker beneath what remained of Seoul, the Earth Security Council received the final report on Operation Nightmare. The mood was somber despite their victory. The Horror Space Project achieved its primary objective, Dr. Sun Hee-yu concluded. The Kelvarian threat has been eliminated, and Earth is now recognized as a sovereign power under galactic protection. "At what cost?" asked Defense Minister Tae-woo Kim. "Nearly 1,400 pilots dead, hundreds more with permanent psychological damage. And this breach that won't close?" President Shin asked, tapping the report. "What are we doing about that?" "We've established a containment perimeter," Sun Hee replied. "The galactic representatives have offered advanced technology to help monitor it. But I must be clear, we don't fully understand what we're dealing with." "The report mentions entities?" the president asked. Sun Hee nodded grimly. "Several pilots independently reported sensing conscious beings within horror space, beings that noticed our intrusion and became curious about our reality." "Are we talking about an invasion?" asked Foreign Minister Jahan. "Not in any conventional sense," Sun Hee said. These entities don't appear to exist in a way we can truly comprehend, but they seem interested in the connection we created. The president closed the report and looked around the table. We survived the Kelvarians, but have we exposed ourselves to something worse? No one had an answer. In orbit, aboard the diplomatic vessel, Admiral Juan concluded her conversation with the Morrigan ambassador. "We will help you monitor the breach," the crystalline being said. "All spacefaring civilizations have a vested interest in preventing horror space incursions." "Thank you," Juan replied. "We welcome the assistance." As the ambassador moved away, it turned back briefly. "Admiral, there is something you should understand. The beings in horror space, they do not think as we do. They do not want what we want. They experience reality in ways we cannot comprehend." "What are you saying?" Juan asked. "Simply this. In trying to defend yourselves, you may have attracted the attention of something far older and stranger than anything in our galaxy. The Kelvarians would have merely killed you. These entities, they might change what it means to be human." The ambassador departed, leaving Juan alone with that chilling thought. That night, all across Earth, people reported strange dreams. Dreams of impossible colors and geometries that shouldn't exist. Dreams of voices speaking in languages never heard on Earth. Dreams of ancient entities reaching toward a small blue planet through a pinpoint of darkness. In the Antarctic facility, Yoon smiled in her restraints as the breach pulsed slightly, exactly in rhythm with her heartbeat. The final line of the Security Council report stated it plainly. "We have defended ourselves, but at what cost? We have opened a door that perhaps cannot be closed." The end.